Let's cross now back to the Garma Festival in the Northern Territory, where the Prime Minister is about to give his keynote address and announce the draft question for a referendum on an Indigenous voice to Parliament. Dan Borgia and Bridget Brennan are there. Dan and Bridget, we are moments away from the Prime Minister's speech, a turning point in the history of relations between First Nations and non-Indigenous Australians. What is the feeling there?
I think there are a lot of feelings here at Garma, don't you agree, Dan? Yeah. Because, of course, there have been many historic speeches given here at this site at Gulkula in northeast Arnhem Land over the years by Prime Ministers past. And there's always a sense of cautious optimism that something will be promised, and today's announcement is deeply significant, with the government announcing the draft question of a proposed referendum to create a permanent Indigenous voice to Parliament. However, of course, there's been speeches in the past and promises made and broken, and we've heard certainly about the promise for treaty decades ago that is yet to eventuate. So I think people are cautious. They're interested to hear from the Prime Minister and many members of his cabinet who are here today. What's your feeling, Dan?
I absolutely agree. That cautious optimism is the sense that I've got this morning. There is a level of excitement that the Prime Minister so soon after such an election would come and make the first keynote speech, if you will, on Indigenous affairs in an Indigenous community right here, as Bridgie mentioned, on this sacred land that has been a special site for ceremony, for communication, for renewal for tens of thousands of years, about having difficult conversations in ways that do bring people together. That today we are expecting the Prime Minister to detail both the question that he would like to see put to Australians in a referendum and the sequence of words that would be enshrined within the Constitution that give rise to a voice to Parliament. But I think you are absolutely right, Bridge, when you talk about the cautious optimism, because we have been here. There have been Prime Ministers that have promised treaties. There have been Prime Ministers that have given important speeches that then there's been a general sense in the community that there's been nothing to follow that there hasn't been, if you will, the rubber hitting the road. The thing that keeps getting mentioned to me is that the challenge now is about bringing all Australians on board for this next journey and explaining why this is not about a win or lose. This is about in developing really the entire democratic system in Australia to include a direct link for First Nations people on this land, on the country you're from, where I'm from, where every Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person is from, to the policymakers in Canberra.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's also a sense that this can't be the only thing that's being offered by the government. Of course, it's not. There are other reform agenda for the government, and we've heard some of that from Linda Burney, the new Minister for Indigenous Australians. But we've heard it certainly today about treaty, about giving Aboriginal organisations and communities more autonomy and power to really drive the change that's needed in so many communities. Here on Yulngu land, there is already a lot of autonomy, Dan. I mean, we've heard from councils here and different organisations that already drive education, economic development on their own land, but there needs to be more. And there was just a very stirring speech from the independent member for Mulka, an independent Northern Territory politician, Aboriginal man, and Yulngu elder Mark Gulaya Yingaya, who spoke about, his frustrations about seeing communities in deep crisis right now. Things aren't changing, he says, in terms of deaths by suicide, terrible overcrowding in housing, and really just not recognising the intelligence and the innovation of Aboriginal people to be able to design their own solutions. So he gave a very stirring address, and he actually suggested, Dan, which I thought was interesting, that the government consider actually putting some wording of a treaty and truth-telling in the Constitution also to give that some permanency. I don't think that's something that we've heard from the Prime Minister, but he said they have to be talking about treaty as well. And
that's such an interesting point because, of course, the Uluru Statement that you know better than anyone, you were there covering it, reporting 5 years ago. You were back there a couple of weeks ago that I want to get to in a moment. But that was really an invitation for the nation to walk together on voice, makarata and truth. Of course, the voice is the part we're discussing right now and expecting to be central in this speech. The makarata is coming together after conflict to find a process of resolution, and truth is is, of course, truth-telling. So it's very interesting that he used this platform to make those comments and such a clarion call for actually a broader conversation. Now, whether or not the government sees that as a possibility is I guess the next question on that.
Look, I think Linda Burney does, because I think she said we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can get started on a referendum as well as talks to a treaty. The thing about a treaty and what we're seeing in state processes already, which are really in the infancy of negotiating with Aboriginal nations and communities, is that it's going to take a very long time. A treaty is a very complex process, whereas what the government is saying is let's get a referendum done quite quickly. We want to get it done within the first term of Parliament. That's the commitment the Prime Minister made during his first election speech on election night. And so they feel that they can start getting this referendum done quickly. I think there is a sense here and among the government that there's a very short window to get it done, to really educate the Australian public and really get that campaign up and running.
Now, whether that leads to us going to a vote, all Australians, on May 27 next year, very much an open question. I don't believe that it's included in the speech, so there might still be some work to do on that front. And of course, the other component about the modelling and whether that's pushed further away. But just on the date, of course, 27th of May has its own significance. We know there have been 44 referendums in Australia. 8 of those have been successful. The most successful in Australian history was in 1967 on the 27th of May to include Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as Australian citizens. There's a great weight of expectation that this referendum, that we are likely to see the words in just a couple of minutes' time, is the unfinished business from 67, isn't it? It's the next chapter of that book.
Yes, well, I think in the Uluru Statement the words are we were counted and now it's time that we were heard, and this is the deep frustration that Aboriginal people feel, that they're sort of screaming into the abyss and that no one is listening, and that successive governments have got it wrong and policies have done real harm. There's been a lot of talk here about the intervention this morning also, a lot of criticism of that policy and its effects in Aboriginal communities in the Northern Territory. So look, these are really weighty matters, but Dan, we're also here celebrating Yolngu culture, which is just so special, and it's an incredible window into this beautiful landscape and these beautiful people, and they're very generous to share this area and this experience with Australians. And of course it's been off for 2 years, so the vibe is quite nice because people are meeting again for the first time.
And there's something so powerful in being able to come back together at this point. I wonder if you might share with everyone the story you were telling yesterday about the dance, because the way that the passion with which you spoke was just so powerful and is so important, I think, for people to hear this morning as well.
Yes, well, while we're behind us, we've got the political forum and waiting, of course, to bring the Prime Minister's speech live to you. On the other end of this festival ground is the Bungal dancing ground, which is just as important as all of this political talk, where clans of the Yolngu Nation come and dance for Dr. Galarrwuy Yunupingu. And it's a really special time for them. And there's a lot of Northern Territory Aboriginal people who come to Garma as well to come for this celebration. And I was on the sidelines a few years ago speaking to one of the clans about their Sugarman dance, which is a very special dance that they do that's particular to their clan. So all of their clans and tribes bringing their particular culture, their traditions and songlines and stories to this site to very much share and allow people to learn and listen.
And because that ties in perfectly with the whole concept of sharing stories, that is one that is tens of thousands of years old in First Nations communities. It's not about writing stories down that then sit in books and get dusty on bookshelves. It is very much living, breathing, evolving, dance, song, storytelling. So everything here is framed around those points to be able to convey messages in really different and powerful ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it just is a very momentous time because, as we mentioned, there is now treaty processes underway in different states and territories. I think there's a growing understanding in the Australian community that we need a new frontier, we need a new era for Aboriginal people. We need a much better understanding of who needs to be in the driving seat to change the things that we need to see some action on, because recently, just this week really, the Productivity Commission's report into Closing the Gap coverage revealed that only 4 out of those 17 refreshed targets with agreement from state and territory governments to meet those are being met, or are on track, I should say. So that's really disappointing, and I think it's really worrying. The Minister for Indigenous Australians, Linda Burney, has acknowledged that it's disappointing progress. She wants to get to work on that as well. So there's a huge amount of work to do, I think, for all Australians.
And part of that is, I mean, we've got to acknowledge, don't we, that it was momentous to have the states and territories come together and expanding quite dramatically those targets to include incarceration and culture and broader on education. The fact that so many of them, 13 out of the 17, as you point out, are behind and in some instances getting worse, is real pause for consideration about what we're doing. Now, there's also the other side of that is, of course, as the Commissioner Mokak mentioned, we only have 2 years of data, so the data sets are evolving and being developed. So that's part of this as well.
And that hadn't been done properly. For a long time.
And in some instances still hasn't been, and there hasn't been that kind of connection between data or even keeping the same data in the states and territories and in the Commonwealth in the same way, which is of course a big challenge. And the other thing of where this really powerfully ties into the work of the Uluru Statement and the discussions now around the voice are of course about the substance, and this is something that the new CLP Senator Jacinta Price highlighted very powerfully in her first speech in Parliament about the substance. What difference is a voice going to make to everyday challenges around domestic violence, education, incarceration, the dramatic difference in health outcomes as well? Those are all things that need to be explored, is what Jacinta Price says. But this is, interestingly, it's not just on Jacinta Price that this is, of course, something that's coming up. But I just want to pause on that thought for a moment, because the Prime Minister is in fact about to walk past us. I'm not sure if we can get a shot of the Prime Minister as he is coming. I think he's going to go to the right of us just here.
He's been stopped by.
He's been stopped, and
there's a man. He's into man. He's just coming.
It's really great to see, isn't it? People having these yarns, like everyday Australians stopping the Prime Minister, just
you
to
don't
say
often see that,
what they think and to share their thoughts. And this is something that is one of these rare opportunities, Bridget, that you get at the Garma Festival when you've got these political leaders, business elite, those from the community sector, in all this close proximity to regular Australians, the 2,000 or so people that have gathered here.
Well, it's been wonderful to join you right now. I'm going to duck off and get some water because that sun is beaming down on us, but we will bring you the Prime Minister as soon as we can, and I'll hand over you to now. Thanks, Dan. Great to
wonderful.
be with you.
And so, of course, we are waiting to hear that speech from the Prime Minister in, we understand, just a little bit of time. Things are a little bit fluid here on the ground at the Garma Festival as we are standing by to bring you that speech. That's coming up shortly, except, we do understand the Prime Minister has just stepped away from heading towards the key forum behind me, where we were expecting him to speak in just the next couple of minutes. And this is going to be a central discussion today around not just that sequence of words that would be put to all Australians to vote on in a referendum, but the other side of that is, of course, around what are the words that would go into the Constitution. So very much an open conversation that we are going to be hearing and seeing in the next little while. There's a break just happening now behind me at the Key Forum. Miriam, we are going to throw back to you now. We'll come back when we understand that the Prime Minister is on his way, but it's been so special to have a yarn this morning about the culture here at Gulkula on the lands of the Gumatj people of the Yolngu tribe.
Dan Borsha, we are waiting just that little bit longer for the Prime Minister's statement. Thank you so much for filling us in on all the background and what's happening there. A fluid situation. We'll be coming back to you shortly. Thank you. Important discussions are taking place in and around Garma, also a celebration and coming together of culture. Early today, Dan Borsha spoke to expert communicator and chief executive of Black Card Australia, Mandinara Bales, about what Garma means to her.
It means I've got all these mixed emotions. Every day you wake up and there's a program that's jam-packed, but I miss half of the program because I'm connecting with people that I saw in 2019 when I was first here, but people that I've been wanting to meet and I haven't been able to meet because of COVID and being on Zoom. So this event not only means reconnecting, but it's also an opportunity to just sit. Like, this is a remote part of Australia. It's ancient lands, and I feel rejuvenated. I come here and just absolutely feel like I can go back to the city and do what I do every other day. So, yeah.
How good does it feel to be able to reconnect? Since 2019, we haven't been able to meet in this way because of the obvious precautions around COVID. How does it feel to be back now?
But it feels like we still know each other, even through Zoom meetings and Teams. 80% of the people that I've seen in the last 2 days, I've had on Zoom meetings. So it's like these big hugs, and then I'm like, hold a minute, do we know each other? And they're like, sorry, we'll fist bump. So it's a really good thing. But not only that, we're engaging with, in terms of my clients at Black Card, I'm engaging with people that have now had, they're more immersed in Aboriginal affairs, like what's happening, who's speaking. Marcia Langton spoke yesterday about curriculum in education. We heard the Prime Minister speak. So, like, the people that I'm working with now, it's like they've had a deeper dive in understanding the current issues. They're not all issues, but also some of the changes and the progress that we've made as a nation.
And I just want to note that viewers might be able to hear clapping behind us. There's a cultural forum going on, people yarning, sitting around the campfire. That I know that you've been very active in those conversations. Black Card, for anyone who's not familiar with it, what is it? What is it all about?
What is Black Card? So in Queensland, you go to Working with Children's card. It's called a blue card. So we came up with the Black Card about 10 years ago, and it's a business that I set up with my grandmother's sister, who's 85 this year. So big shout out to Aunt Lilla. She's a big ABC fan. So Black Card is about how do we educate all people living in this country about the tens of thousands of years of knowledge that comes directly from this land. So we're educating people about Aboriginal terms of reference, or we call it cultural capability training, which every corporate, government, organisation, everybody's looking at other ways of engaging with not just First Nations peoples, but any of the 300 different nationalities that live in Australia. And
as well as that, you have become renowned for communicating. You've got a podcast. Tell me about that.
Okay. So my dad, most people, he passed 6 years ago, his name was Tiger Bales, and was a pioneer in Indigenous media. So I grew up in the media, I come from a politically active family, and I studied radio, and when COVID hit, I launched a podcast. I went back to an old skill set, and now it's kind of taken over my life. So Black Magic Woman, if anyone wants to download it, it's a platform where I'm activating not just First Nations voices, but anyone that I see that's making a positive contribution to this country. 80% is about who they are and 20% is about business. So in Aboriginal culture, who you are is much more important than what you do.
Moving to other news now, more than 700 kilometres from Darwin on the coast of isolated southeast Arnhem Land, education is delivered a little differently. A pre-university course is preparing Indigenous students to take on degrees in the Big Smoke, combining academic learning with cultural content taught by elders to help build the next generation of leaders. Roxanne Fitzgerald reports.
Forget maps in this part of the world. This labyrinth requires an escort and a sturdy four-wheel drive. In one of the Northern Territory's most remote areas, this is the Bush University. Class time! And these students are days away from graduating.
Most of you got a distinction and high distinction, so congratulations.
In this pocket of the world, less than 1% of Indigenous students access university. But this intensive course is changing that.
It's building up a pathway for them.
Weegaba Study Hub is a two-way education program that's designed to provide a tertiary pathway to remote Indigenous students from Arnhem Land. Two-way education means learning in both Indigenous ways and Western ways.
Over 20 weeks, students build their academic skills to tackle further studies in the Big Smoke, with a view of creating the next generation of leaders equipped with strong cultural foundations and careers that will help their community.
We want to maintain it and revitalize it.
Revitalization of our cultural heritage.
As well as our languages.
Elders and cultural teachers are passing on ancient knowledge about kinship systems, bush medicines, and the impacts of colonisation.
White men be down on the plains.
Today's lesson is on country, hunting for natural dyes for weaving. Since its inception in 2018, the Bush Uni has seen 80 students graduate and 23 students start degrees at Macquarie University in Sydney. This cohort hopes to be there soon, and their reasons are inspiring.
I want to be a role model, not just for my daughter, but for the sake of all my families.
Eddie also wants to be a leader in his community of Nooka. After years of seeing the health clinic flounder under staffing issues, he hopes to become an Aboriginal health worker.
It's going to be my first time in Sydney. Never been down there yet, but I'm looking forward to go.
Penny wants to eradicate a disease she's fought since a young age.
I want to be a doctor one day, probably, because a lot of people, especially for myself, I've got a rheumatic heart.
Dr. Amelia Enns says while pathways do exist, barriers to uni can often seem insurmountable, especially when there is not always access to computers or the internet.
At the end of the day, people, maybe don't feel comfortable to step forward into this unknown space and walk in both worlds. It is a very scary thing when you come from a place where English is your second, third, fourth, fifth language.
In just a couple of months, Melissa will graduate from Macquarie, making her the first university graduate from her community since the 80s. She's planning to return.
The first Aboriginal teacher in Nooka for like over 40 years.
Just metres from the beach and accessed only via a treacherous sandy path, it's a university like no other. And with funding recently secured for the next 4 years, it's hoped this is just the beginning. Roxanne Fitzgerald, ABC News.
Let's now cross back to the Garma Festival in Northern Territory. The Prime Minister is about to give his keynote address there. And we are speaking now to Dan Borsche, who is coming to us live. Dan, we are moments away from the Prime Minister. So much expectation, obviously, for this moment.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, Miriam. It's good to be back with you. The Prime Minister just walked past and he didn't want to keep people waiting a moment longer. Things have been a bit fluid on the ground here at Garma ahead of the Prime Minister giving that speech. This is his first keynote address on Indigenous affairs in an Indigenous community ahead of what we are expecting to be the Prime Minister announcing two things today. One, the question that he would like put to Australian voters in a referendum, and also the sequence of words that would be introduced as a result, if that was successful, into the Constitution. And that goes to the heart of an Indigenous voice to Parliament, connecting up country, nation groups like the one here of the Ulnu people, right around this nation to the power makers and policy makers in Canberra in the federal parliament. And of course there's so much anticipation because this is what we've been hearing from the Prime Minister for the last couple of months, in fact, since he took office. That first night after he won the election, he put an Indigenous voice right at the heart of his policy and social agenda and made it very clear that he wanted to see this happen and to see this happen as soon as possible. In addition to that, the Prime Minister, when he's been speaking, he speaks so passionately about how this would be something about being generous and about politeness to First Nations people and creating that avenue for that conversation. So we are expecting that in the next little while when that speech gets underway just behind me at the Key Forum here in Gulkula. And we do know that there is a lot of anticipation as we're hearing those crowds cheering. We understand that the Prime Minister is being asked to step up right now, and we are just going to have a look in at that right now.
Garma in Arnhem Land, about to give his keynote address at this festival to do with recognising the Indigenous voice of people to Parliament and providing a question to go to a referendum. Let's listen in to the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese.
Nada, Bukul, Garulpan, Gumach, Yotu Yindi, Yindi, Nago, Yulnu, Mala. I acknowledge the people of the Yolngu Nation. I recognise all the elders, leaders and families who have made great contributions to our nation. In particular, I acknowledge the Gumatj clan, whose lands we are meeting on today. Last night's Bungal was a deeply moving moment for me. It was an honour to bear witness to dance and song and story and tradition, tracing back some 60,000 years. As the breeze came across me, your ancestors' presence in these lands and waters makes real your 60,000 years and more custodianship of this land. And I was also grateful for the chance to meet again with Galloway and share in his wisdom, to talk about the opportunities and the challenges in this very special part of Australia. Friends, I am delighted to be back at Garma for my 4th visit, and I am delighted that Garma is back. Here, on what is, was, and always will be Aboriginal land, today I reaffirm my government's solemn promise to implement the Uluru Statement from the Heart in full. I'm joined by my colleagues, Linda Burney, the Minister for Indigenous Affairs. The magnificent Senator Patrick Dodson. He'll keep me on track, don't worry about that. Special Envoy for Reconciliation and the implementation of the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Senator Malarndirri McCarthy, the Assistant Minister for Indigenous Australians and Indigenous Health. The Attorney-General, Mark Dreyfus. Luke Gosling, the Member for Solomon. The Northern Territory's Chief Minister, Natasha Files. And the newest addition of the team, the new Member for Lingari, Marion Scrimgeour. And in the spirit of cooperation, which is so necessary, can I acknowledge the Shadow Minister for Indigenous Affairs and the Shadow Attorney-General, Julian Leeser. Thanks, Julian. I look forward to working with you. We are all here, eager to work with you to bring our commitment to Uluru to life, to see Australia answer that gracious, patient call for respect and truth and unity. The Uluru Statement is a hand outstretched, a moving show of faith in Australian decency and Australian fairness from people who have been given every reason to forsake their hope in both. I am determined, as a government, as a country, that we grasp that hand of healing, we repay that faith, we rise to the moment, to work with you in lifting the words off the page and lifting our whole nation up, to work with a new spirit of partnership between government and First Nations people, through the work of Makarrata, treaty making and truth-telling, and by enshrining a voice to Parliament in our Constitution. We approach these tasks and the work of constitutional change with humility and with hope. Humility because over 200 years of broken promises and betrayals, failures and false starts demands nothing less. Humility because so many times the gap between the words and deeds of governments has been as wide as this great continent. But also hope. Hope in your abilities as advocates and campaigners, as champions for this cause. And hope because I believe the tide is running our way. I believe the momentum is with us as never before. I believe this country is ready for this reform. I believe there is room in Australian hearts for the statement from the heart. We are seeking a momentous change, but it is also a very simple one. It's not a matter of special treatment or preferential power. It's about consulting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples on the decisions that affect you. Nothing more, but nothing less. This is simple courtesy. It is common decency. It recognises the centuries-old failure that my dear friend Paul Keating spoke of at Redfern. The failure to ask the most basic human question: how would I feel if this were done to me? And along with common courtesy, it is common sense. Respect works. When a government listens to people with experience, with earned knowledge of kinship and country and culture and community, when we trust in the values of self-determination and empowerment, then the policies and programs are always more effective. We see it with justice reinvestment, Indigenous ranges, respecting homelands, and the National Partnership Agreement process driven by the Coalition of Peaks and the remarkable Pat Turner. There are success stories out there, but we know they are not universal. Enshrining a voice in the Constitution gives the principles of respect and consultation strength and status. Writing the voice into the Constitution means a willingness to listen won't depend on who is in government or who is Prime Minister. The voice will exist and endure outside of the ups and downs of election cycles and the weakness of short-term politics. It will be an unflinching source of advice and accountability, not a third chamber, not a rolling veto, not a blank cheque, but a body with the perspective and the power and the platform to tell the government and the parliament the truth about what is working and what is not. To tell the truth with clarity, with conviction, because a voice enshrined in the Constitution cannot be silenced. Friends, I believe the best way to seize the momentum is by settling as soon as possible on the referendum question that will be put to the people of Australia. Now, I respect the fact that many people have done a power of good work to bring us to this point, particularly the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander campaigners, best represented by the delegates to the Uluru Convention in 2017. I am grateful and I honour everyone who has made a contribution to the process. And now I am hoping that we can draw those threads together. I am hoping we can progress the efforts of good-willed, hard-working people who want to see the nation move forward and justice realised, recognising that this is one of the steps in our nation's journey of healing. Our starting point is a recommendation to add 3 sentences to the Constitution in recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders as the first peoples of Australia. 1. There shall be a body to be called the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice. 2. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice may make representations to Parliament and the executive government on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And 3. Powers and procedures of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice. These draft provisions can be seen as the next step in the discussion about constitutional change. This may not be the final form of words, but I think it is how we can get to a final form of words. In the same way, alongside these provisions, I would like us to present the Australian people with the clearest possible referendum question. We should consider asking our fellow Australians something as simple but something as clear as this. Do you support an alteration to the Constitution that establishes an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice? A straightforward proposition, a simple principle, a question from the heart. We can use this question and the provisions as the basis for further consultation, not as a final decision, but as the basis for dialogue, something to give the conversation shape and form. I ask all Australians of goodwill to engage on this. Respectfully, purposefully, we are seeking to secure support for the question and the associated provisions in time for a successful referendum in this term of Parliament. If not now, when? If not now, when? Back in 1967, not a single member of the House of Representatives or the Senate voted against the referendum provisions. In the same spirit, I hope that the opposition and the crossbench will support the proposal, join the campaign for a yes vote, and bring their supporters to the cause. We will seek out every ally and every advocate from, to quote the statement, every point under the southern sky. Fundamentally, this is a reform I believe every Australian can embrace, from all walks of life, in every part of the country, from every faith and background and tradition, because it speaks to values that we all share and honour: fairness, respect, decency. Enshrining a voice will be a national achievement. It will be above politics, a unifying Australian moment. There may well be misinformation and fear campaigns to counter, but perhaps the greatest threat to the cause is indifference. The notion that this is a nice piece of symbolism, but it will have no practical benefit, or that somehow advocating for a voice comes at the expense of expanding economic opportunity, or improving community safety, or lifting education standards, or helping people get the health care they deserve or find the housing that they need. Championing a voice won't stop us from upgrading all-weather roads so communities can get the supplies and services that they need. It won't delay our plan to train 500 new Aboriginal healthcare workers. It won't stand in the way of our new investments in life-saving kidney dialysis treatment. Let us all understand this very clearly. Australia does not have to choose between improving people's lives and amending the Constitution. We can do both, and we have to. And I say this very clearly, because 121 years of Commonwealth governments in Canberra arrogantly believing they know enough to impose their own solutions on Aboriginal people have brought us to this point. This torment of powerlessness, a life expectancy gap of 20 years, some of the worst incarceration rates in the world, a broken system that burns billions of dollars and delivers precious little for the people who are supposed to be able to trust in it. And if governments simply continue to do the same thing and insist they know better, then things will get worse. Friends, in my lifetime there has been an extraordinary and joyous change in the way that Australians from all walks of life have embraced the privilege that we have to share this island continent with the world's oldest continuous culture. We have cast aside the discriminatory fiction of terra nullius and offered a national apology to the stolen generations. We have said sorry and begun the task of making good. States and territories are embarked on agreement making, truth-telling and the work of treaty. First Nations people sit in our parliaments in record numbers and serve as ministers. Our environment benefits from the wisdom of people who have cared for it and thrived in it through hundreds of generations. The cult of forgetfulness, the great Australian silence that dishonoured our history, has been broken by a chorus of song and language and art and sport and celebration. You haven't just witnessed that change, you've fought for it, you've championed it. You've been the spark and carried the fire to every corner of this vast country. And I believe Australians, as fair-minded people, recognise that if we want to share in the riches of 60,000 years of history and tradition, then we also share in the responsibility for helping First Nations people build and own a better future. Because we are all diminished, all of us, when First Nations people are denied their right to a happy and fulfilling life, denied the chance to play a full part in the life of our great country. We are all diminished and we are all involved. And soon, all of us, every one of us, will have the chance to exercise our democratic right and our basic human responsibility to vote for something better, to have a sense of ownership over the change that this country so desperately needs. Friends, a referendum is a high hurdle to clear. You know that, and so do we. So do we. We recognise the risk of failure, but we also recognise the risk of failing to try. We see this referendum as a magnificent opportunity for Australia. I am optimistic that this historic decision, this long overdue embrace of truth and justice and decency and respect for First Nations people, will be voted into law by the people of Australia. The voice of the Australian people will create a voice to Parliament. All Australians have a chance to to own this change, to be proud of it, to be counted and heard on the right side of history, to vote the unique Australian gift of the wisdom of the world's oldest continuous civilisation into the constitution of our nation, into our birth certificate. My optimism for the success of this referendum derives from my optimistic view of the Australian character. And I am hopeful in years to come, when we gather here at Garma, we will be able to measure that success, not just by the number of people who vote for a voice, but by the lives that the voice helps to change. The communities it empowers, the opportunities it creates, the justice it delivers, the security it will bring to First Nations people around our country. I am determined for us to succeed in this great project, and working together with humility, with hope, I am absolutely sure that we can. Thank you very much.
We've been hearing there from the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, speaking from the Garma Festival on Gumatj country in the Northern Territory, receiving a very warm reception there from those in attendance. To hear the words where the Prime Minister has outlined the process for taking a question to the Australian people on enshrining an Indigenous voice to Parliament in the Australian Constitution. Let's now bring in Dan Borsche, who is there at Garma, has been listening to the Prime Minister's address. And Dan, an impassioned speech from the Prime Minister. I note also he began in Yolngu, so wanting to really, cross the divider, if you can put it that way, for First Nations, non-Indigenous Australians, and recognise the country that this is happening on Gumatj country. Just take us through what the Prime Minister had to say, how this is now been formulated.
Yeah, Miriam, good afternoon to you. Well, the reaction from the crowd just then, what appeared to me to be a standing ovation, very telling. There is a buzz circulating around here right now, and you get a sense that we were just witness to a moment in history. The Prime Minister clearly saying this is a priority, to have a voice to Parliament enshrined within the Constitution that gives an avenue for First Nations people across our nation to speak directly to the politicians in federal Parliament, to raise issues from here, from this country, from the nation states across our country, to be able to communicate that. And a real sense of optimism there. The Prime Minister not shying away, though, from what is expected to be some opposition. He went directly to that, but added that perhaps the greatest threat to the case is indifference. This is a speech that the Prime Minister wanted to centre on hope and on humility, adding that years of broken promises, betrayals, failures and false starts demand nothing less than hope and also humility. And of course the Prime Minister there detailing exactly the reform that he sees, that he wants in place. Let's have a look at some of the detail. At first instance, the Prime Minister saying that this is a sequence of words that he would like to see as a proposed question to Australians on a referendum. Do you support an alteration of the Constitution that establishes an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice? And then the sequence of words that would be enshrined within the Constitution if that were to be successful. One, that there shall be a body to be called the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. 2, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice may make representations to Parliament and the executive government on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And 3, that the Parliament shall, subject to this Constitution, have power to make laws with respect to the composition, the functions, the powers, the procedures of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. That last point really going to the heart of some concern that this might be seen as a third chamber, as a veto power, a blank check. Well, the Prime Minister decisively tackling those 3 head-on, saying no, it's not. This is about politely bringing people together, creating an opportunity and a space for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to connect like never before. There was also a point there where the Prime Minister said this does not have to be a choice between improving people's lives and amending the Constitution. We can do both, and we have to do both. Going to the heart of some of the criticism that what would be the substance of a voice, what would be on offer to actually create tangible, real, lifelong change to deal with issues, as the Prime Minister highlighted there, about roads into remote communities, to get fresh fruit and vegetables into some of the most remote, isolated stretches of the country. He said we can do both, and in fact we actually have to. If not now, when? If not now, when? The Prime Minister said that twice, Miriam. And I don't know about you, but when I heard that, it was a lean-in moment where you pause and for a moment go, this is a moment in time. Feels to be a moment of change. There has been this growing sense that the stories of First Nations Australians are the stories of all Australians, that they're the same threads, the threads in the same rope that they tie together. Margot Neal, the boss of the National Indigenous area of the National Museum of Australia, says that the Indigenous story didn't end in 1788. The Australian story didn't start in 1788, that they intertwined together. All of those stories are all of ours now, and I think that's the sense that I got from the Prime Minister there, really trying to tie together this. He used the term Bullanda there, which is a Yolngu word that means white people. So he was really, as you touched on at the start, Mim, leaning into this conversation about bridging divides, bringing people together, because that's exactly what is needed if a reform of this type, a change to the Constitution, is to be successful. There have been 44 referendums in Australia's history. Just 8 have been successful. Clearly, we are a country that is reluctant to change our constitution. Interestingly, though, the most successful in Australian history was in 1967, the 27th of May. That was to include Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as Australian citizens. An overwhelming result, more than 90% saying, yes, this is what we have to do. You get a sense that the architects of the Uluru Statement, and I'm sure those that have been listening today to the Prime Minister will be hoping to emulate that kind of success or better when this goes to a referendum. Now, the question of a date, still open. That wasn't touched upon in that speech just then. And also this broader discussion about whether there needs to be a model finalised before the nation goes to a vote. I think that's still one that will continue on. We know there's going to be a lot more discussion on all of those topics right here at Garma over the coming days, but of course across our nation in the weeks and months ahead, because as the Prime Minister said, this is a conversation that we all have to lean into.
Indeed, Dan, this was framed very much as an invitation for all Australians to embrace this process, to understand this process, and to reach across as a nation and to, forge a new future together, where our First Nations people will be recognised in that critical founding document for the nation. Of course, as you mentioned there was a lot contained in that speech. There were pointers to that very important 1967 referendum. The Prime Minister saying that it was outstanding in the amount of support that it received both in the House of Representatives and in the Senate, not a vote against that particular referendum. I note as well that we have got the opposition represented there today in Garma. Is there a sense that we will have the same sort of momentum behind this question, which is now being formulated for the public to consider?
Oh, Miriam, that indeed is the very central question to where to from here. Is this going to receive bipartisan support? Is this going to have the sort of success that we saw in 1967 that, as you rightly mentioned, reflecting on the Prime Minister's speech, there wasn't a member of the House or the Senate who voted against that. Now, would this be the case in this discussion? That question around bipartisanship is crucial, isn't it? It's one that's really central to this. Although I was speaking to an Indigenous leader this morning who said to me that the bipartisan is important, but it's more important to create an environment where everyone can lean and step into this together to have this conversation. Now, if people choose not to, then that's actually their right as well. And that point around bipartisanship, that's something that's been touched on by Jacinta Price, the new CLP senator, in just the last couple of days in her first speech to Parliament. She was worried that the Voice wouldn't create an avenue to have tangible change, to actually create the change that is so clearly desired. Now, if that's going to be the case, the Prime Minister seems to have already been looking to head that off at the start, because he spoke there about it's not a choice between either dealing with the immediate challenges, of which there are many, or having a voice to Parliament. That in fact, perhaps the two, as other elders have said to me, are opposite sides of the same coin. That in order to have, when you have the voice, it creates an avenue to have the conversations about the more substantive change that is clearly required. If we're to look at the latest report that came out from the Productivity Commission, just 4 of those 17 closing the gap targets are on track, indicating that there is such a significant body left to do, of work to do, Mim.
Yeah, I do note as well, Dan, that in the Prime Minister's speech, we touched on those concerns around how a voice to Parliament would operate, that it would not be a third chamber of Parliament, that it would not have veto power and things like that. But he also spoke as well of the need for it to provide advice and accountability to the government of the day. So clearly that is a key concern and priority. It'll be interesting to see how that would be formulated, because as you point out, we really have so much work that continues to be done, that needs to still be done in order to see real change, real improvement in the lives of our First Nations Australians.
Oh, my word. And that language that you highlight there and point to is very crucial. That's jumped out at me as well. In one instance, when we talk about that challenge or that issue that's been raised, that it might be a third chamber or a veto power, well, the Prime Minister headed that off fairly decisively, and those very words that would be enshrined in the Constitution do the same. They keep the sovereignty of this decision-making process within the Parliament. It is up to the Parliament of the day to make the decisions. This would just be to say you must have a voice. How it works, what it looks like, if we're to go off what we've just heard from the Prime Minister, would be open to debate of the Parliament of the day. But of course, the other challenge, or that's associated with that, is just about how you get to that point of having that design, because this is the work that Professors Marcia Langton and Tom Garma, both esteemed Indigenous academics, did. That big body of work for the former Minister for Indigenous Australians, Ken Wyatt, in seeking to speak directly to Indigenous Australians about what is it that you want, what's the art of the possible. And I would encourage anyone to have a look at their report that came out last year, because it goes into great detail, and they've gone to great pains to map out the challenges and the opportunities and some of the different ways of a model going ahead. Now, all of that process from here, it remains to be seen if that's adopted or whether there's a different process at foot. But these are some of the discussions that we're likely to see now, Miriam, because now we have a clear dagger in the sand from the Prime Minister about just where he sees the pathway or the starting to the roadmap forward, and how the next steps begin to unfold. But you get the sense that there will be a lot more of those big discussions, mapping out the detail and just how to take those next steps.
And Dan, as well, one more point that really stood out for me from that speech, obviously a lot contained in it, but one of the points that the Prime Minister really stressed was that he embraced the Uluru Statement in full. And within that statement, of course, we also have those key issues of truth-telling and treaty-making. So additional elements there for further discussion.
Oh, Miriam, you are spot on. Like that wasn't lost on me either. And in fact, when our colleague Bridget Brennan was here a little earlier, she was going to that very point, that was a speech that's just been made about what about enshrining the discussion and the wording around makarata or treaty process after conflict, which is a term that comes from this country, your new country, and then also the truth-telling part as well. Does that get looked at in the frame of constitutional reform, or is that embedded or looked at upon the pathway from here? And of course, you're right that the Uluru Statement of the Heart, that invitation to the nation 5 years ago, made it very clear that there are 3 strands to these reforms that would look at doing the unfinished business that came out of the 1967 referendum. And so important to many Indigenous leaders are that they are looked at in their entirety, that this is about having multiple conversations about a reform agenda going forward that not only embeds a voice but looks to the future with a process around treaty making, but then also does that crucial part about truth telling, because if we are not telling the truth stories about Australia, how can we understand truly who we are? That's, to me, what the whole concept of truth-telling is about. We need to understand what's happened. We need to be able to talk that, reflect upon that, and ensure that that's known going forward. That's a really crucial part of this whole discussion.
Dan Borscher bringing it all together for us there live from Garma in Arnhem Land, the Northern Territory. Thank you. Well, now let's get some sport news with Jared Coote.